Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. The Outdoor Adventure Series celebrates individuals and families, businesses, and organizations that seek out and promote the exploration, stewardship, conservation, access, and enjoyment of the outdoors. Our guest today is Will McLean Greeley. Will is the author of the book, A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate. Will, it is a pleasure to have you on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast.
Well, thank you, Howard. I really appreciate your inviting me today.
Fantastic. And I'm sure my listeners are going to be curious, why do you have an author on your podcast? Because I'm usually talking about hiking and access, and well, I actually did use the word Birdman of the Senate, and I guess we're going to learn more about that, but this is not a traditional podcast for me, and so I'm really excited when we were connected with each other, and I thought, I love birding. I know a lot of peers in the outdoor space that enjoy birding, and your book, Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, Birdman of the Senate, I think it's a perfect match for the podcast. And again, I'm glad you're here. And I would love if you could, Will, is to share a little information about yourself. Give us a little taste of your background.
Yeah. Well, Howard, I'm a first-time author. I had a 35-year career in market research that was a little bit of a detour for me. When I went to college, I wanted to be a history professor. I went to University of Michigan, got a undergraduate and master's degree, was on a track to do a PhD, and life got in the way. I just got a job to start paying off some student loans, and thought I'd go back and complete the process and get a PhD and teach U.S. history. But I fell in love with business and market research and had a 35-year career in government and business, a number of different settings. But I retired in 2018, and that was the 100th anniversary of the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act. I assume many of your listeners, if they love the outdoors, have probably heard of this. This is the major bird protection legislation that's still in effect today, passed in 1918. And some of this news coverage talked about George P. McLean and his leadership role in passing this legislation. So I determined to learn his life story. He happens to be my great-great-uncle, and I've always had this nagging curiosity to learn more about him. And so after a 4-year research and writing journey, getting a publisher, the Rochester Institute of Technology Press, I have uncovered a fascinating story of a life well lived.
So I'm curious, growing up and having the name McLean, was it always very apparent to you that you had really a famous relative in your family tree?
It's kind of like in middle school when you go around the lunch table and everybody tells everyone else their middle name, and come to me and they'd say McLean. Well, why did you get that name? So I'd ask my parents, and they gave me very unsatisfying answers. My dad was a lifelong FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Democrat, and George P. McLean happened to be a Theodore Roosevelt type Republican. And so part of my dad's loyalty to FDR meant that he had a special contempt for any Republican predecessor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, including his Uncle George, his great Uncle George McLean, who was in the U.S. Senate from 1911 to 1929. He was also governor of Connecticut, but he was a Republican. And we think life is polarized today. Well, it's always been that way. And for my dad, he was something of a pariah, a black sheep. And he was very dismissive when I would ask him about him. And my aunts and uncles were pretty much the same way, because they too had that same political outlook. It's a lesson that we often fall into black and white thinking. You don't like one thing about a person, and therefore everything is bad.
Right.
And so they didn't like his stance on the League of Nations, for example. They thought he was opposed to that, and that's the forerunner of the United Nations.
Mhm.
But anyway, I think they missed out in not knowing the full scope of his life, particularly when you take into context his great achievement of leading passage of this Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which was really the turning point in the way that we in the United States, and I believe around the world, treat and protect our birds. And it's a fascinating story. It's a huge accomplishment. And there's many other things I've uncovered about his life that I found equally fascinating.
Okay. As you were going on and having your career in market research, had you done or conducted any research up to that point of retirement, or what was that moment for you when you said, I want to get to know Senator George P. McLean?
Yeah. Well, I had a professor in college that encouraged us to kind of take an entrepreneurial mindset about our interest in history. And he said, start your own archives, your own historical manuscript collection that's meaningful to you. And so fortunately, throughout my life, I would ask my aunts and uncles and other relatives for their memories about this man. And many of them wrote down memoirs, not just for me, but they had their own sets of memoirs. And I would collect and collate all of this. And so over time, I gradually developed an archive of writings, unpublished writings within my own family that talked about Senator McLean, what he meant to them, what his impact was, what kind of personality he had. And so I brought a lot of those writings into my research from 2018 on. Incidentally, I had about 300 sources in total to come up with this book. The book was peer reviewed by my publisher, some university professors who suggested other sources. So it's a very comprehensive look at the era in which McLean lived. He was born in 1857, died in 1932. And also, I incorporated a lot of newspaper coverage of his life, his speeches on the Senate floor and the congressional record. But I did pull in a lot of that unpublished writing, these personal reflections of people who knew him in the form of my aunts and uncles and other relatives.
What did you learn about who he was and the type of individual he was on the turn of the last century? I mean, it's kind of I don't know where the term came from. I should know this if I was a historian, this manifest destiny. I think it was Jefferson. We need to go west. And this is the United States was ours for the taking. And our mentality is we build things, we produce things, we cut things down, we hunt things if they serve a purpose. And so I'm curious, in this era, who was this individual?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I think in many ways he was a little conflicted in the sense that he embraced the industrialization that was occurring after the American Civil War. On one hand, he embraced that, and he loved modern things in terms of the job creation that was flowing into his home state of Connecticut. This was the home of many immigrants coming off of Ellis Island. They would go to Connecticut and work in the manufacturing plants there. But he was conflicted in the sense that he also loved nature. He grew up on a subsistence farm in rural Connecticut, and he was a hunter. And as they say, hunters often make the best conservationists because they want to keep a balance in nature. And he, as a young adult, started to see dramatic declines in bird populations. And so I think he was conflicted in the sense that he saw industrialization, modernity happening on one hand, and he embraced that and supported it. But on the other hand, he was appalled at the excessive, out of control hunting that was needed to be stemmed or stopped. And this was the crux of the issue that he dealt with when he got to the U.S. Senate was, how do you stop this out of control, excessive hunting that is putting many birds on the fast track to extinction.
What were some of the moments for him that tipped his thinking that we need to do something, or I need to champion this effort? What do you think that might have been?
When he got to the U.S. Senate, his maiden speech was on the topic of bird protection legislation at the federal level. So I think actions speak louder than words. That it's obvious that this was on his heart to bring this issue to the Congress. Other people before him had failed to get anything passed. It had always been blocked by filibuster or died in committee. But I think his feelings about hunting changed as a young adult. He eventually renounced hunting, and the thing he really disliked was the advent of the pump shotgun around 1890. He thought that put birds at a tremendous disadvantage, and he saw many people abusing this new technology, hunting excessively for the plumage trade, for women's hats, and then hunting to feed a growing population. Many people were poor, and they hunted birds like the passenger pigeon and ducks and many other, even songbirds, as a cheap source of protein. And so I think he felt that hunting needed to be better regulated, and that the states were doing a very poor job. There was very little enforcement, and that this problem needed to be addressed by the federal government. And so this was essentially a states' rights versus federal government argument that he wanted to resolve once he got into Congress.
What kind of blockage or impediments to this need, this desire to pursue a legislation at the federal level? What did he face when he got to Congress?
Yeah, there were essentially three groups that were allied against him. First, there were the hunters, and these were, in most cases, millionaire hunting clubs that were set up along this Mississippi flyway in states like Missouri and Arkansas, and they prized the spring hunting season. Now, we don't have that today. We only hunt in the fall, but they've set up these clubs and invite these hunters in, and it was easy pickings to hunt birds in the spring. But if you want to put birds on the fast track to extinction, hunt them while they're nesting, hunt them and kill their babies at the same time. And so McLean wanted to put an end to this spring hunting season that was so popular and so prized by many hunting clubs throughout the United States. The second group were business interests aligned with the hat industry, or what was called the millinery industry. There were over 125,000 people employed in making hats in America around 1910. And many of these were immigrant women who came to this country from France or Germany or elsewhere, Italy, with this skill, and they were meeting a market demand. The most valuable cargo on the Titanic that when sunk were feathers, destined from London to New York City, worth over $3 million in today's currency.
Wow.
And so that industry was allied against any kind of federal protection because plumage hunting was very, very profitable. But the most formidable opposition to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act were the states' rights advocates. They argued very compellingly that the federal government lacked the constitutional authority to intervene in areas that were reserved for the state governments. And so that was the most difficult challenge for McLean and others, was to find a way to overcome this eventual inevitable challenge that everyone knew was going to happen in the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's what I find so admirable about McLean and others, was how they figured this out, the workaround that they came up with to ensure that the U.S. Supreme Court could not strike it down.
Can you share a little bit about that? Because that is exactly what was going through my head. They had a lot of opponents, hunters, the millers, the states' rights, and it takes a lot of effort to pass a bill. And I can imagine it's just as difficult back then in the early 1918 era as it is today, because of the politicization of what's going on. But how did he and his supporters, and I'm actually curious too, well, who were his supporters? How did they eventually chip away at the opposition?
Yeah, I think his ability to derive consensus among a variety of groups was key to getting this legislation passed. For instance, he enlisted many of these new Audubon societies that were created in the late 1890s, early 1900s. They were set up to preserve and protect birds, not to lead tours or put out publications about birding. They were all about protecting birds. So he enlisted them. Other leading conservationists of the day, I incorporate into the narrative of my book, people like John Burroughs. Henry Ford was a businessman who was a really serious birder. He was supported this legislation. But McLean also involved gun manufacturers. And some people find that ironic or surprising. But Connecticut was the hotbed for gun manufacturing. It had been since the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. It was even bigger. And he convinced them that it was in their interest to regulate hunting long term, and that they needed to be supportive of this legislation as well. But the most significant ally that he was able to cultivate was President Woodrow Wilson, who was from the opposite political party. He was a Democrat, McLean a Republican, but the two managed to come together and to ensure this legislation would pass after a 7-year struggle in July of 1918, when the world was at war, including the United States and in Europe, war in Europe. And the opponents of this legislation tried once again to delay its passage, citing the fact that we were at war and that they would table this legislation indefinitely. This is a tactic they'd used for decades, to table and to kill this bill in committee. But McLean and Wilson came together despite their differences, and had this legislation was signed on July 3rd, 1918, at the height of our participation in World War I.
I find it very interesting. It was July 3rd, just given that the next day is our Independence Day.
Yeah.
So the act is, you had mentioned earlier, it's the 100th anniversary of the act was 2018. You retired, and then recently, not in the not too distant past, there were attempts to chip away at this act. And
Right.
But I'm curious, once it was passed, what was the impact that you were able to glean from it, of the impact on the bird species, the migration, the organization around what you can hunt and when you can hunt? What were some of those impacts that we would have noticed if we were watching the breadcrumbs, so to speak?
Right. Well, there was an enforcement mechanism put in place where game wardens were put under contract to the federal government to enforce this legislation. It was immediately challenged in 1920 by the state of Missouri, that said that the federal government had no right to supersede their state laws. The state of Missouri was at the core of the resistance, in my opinion. In my book, I talk about the U.S. Senator from Missouri, and he and McLean exchanged hot debates on the Senate floor that are really entertaining, and I show them in my book. But at one time in Missouri, because they liked the spring hunting season so much, in the late 1800s, I think it was, they had one hunting law, and that was you couldn't hunt on Sunday. But otherwise, you could hunt whatever you wanted, however much, wherever you wanted, at any time of year. And so they challenged the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found in support of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in 1920. And so that really ushered in the strength of this act. It beefed up enforcement. There were heavy fines that were levied for people who um, who broke this law. But at the same time, there were other people that were trying to end this fad and this fashion of women's wearing feathers in their hats. And so that certainly cut down on the demand for hunting. So I think that it gradually rolled out. But Howard, the most dramatic example of the effectiveness of this act relates to the bald eagle.
Mm.
Now, the legal framework in which the bald eagle made its resurgence is the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It's allowing the federal government through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to oversee conservation of birds. When the bald eagle was named our national symbol in 1782, there were some 500,000 bald eagles in North America. Very prolific bird. In 1963, there were just a couple thousand left. There were only 400 nesting pairs of bald eagles in North America, or in the 48 states. So we were down to several thousands, and this is a bird, our national symbol, was facing probable extinction. But it was because of the MBTA, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that over the decades, the bald eagle has resurged. It was removed from the endangered species list in 2007. And today, there are over 70,000 nesting pairs of bald eagles in North America, up from 400 in 1963. And I think the number of bald eagles now, individual eagles, is like 380,000 in the 48 states. That makes me feel good.
Oh, yes.
To know that that bird is that prolific again. It's almost back to levels of the 1700s. And it's because of this legislation and the mindset that people gradually accepted that the federal government plays this watchdog role. And there's teeth in this law. There are serious fines against people who would dare to hunt a bald eagle. Mm-hmm. To me, that is a testament to this legislation and why I think it was so important, and a great example of how government can work and how we should feel good about that.
It's not lost on me from when I was a youngster back in the 60s, when the bald eagle was very much endangered, and the impact, though I did not know enough about it, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, to appreciate what this act was going to have and being able to protect the wildlife like the eagle. What are some of the other species that have benefited from this act being in place?
Yeah, there were several birds that were on the fast track to extinction. The snowy egret among them, the flamingo, the whooping crane, the trumpeter swan, the wood duck. Those birds were prized for their colorful feathers and were being hunted to levels that were reaching extinction in the early 1900s. Here's another example, though. It wasn't just women's hats that was showing this use of feathers. McLean decried on the Senate floor a man's vest that was made out of hummingbird skins. Several hundred hummingbirds had been killed to make this colorful vest that cost $10,000 in 1910. Wow. Probably over $100,000 today. The wealth that some people had, the vanity that they would indulge in. And so I think that's just another example that it was such a free-for-all atmosphere in those days, and that people would conceive of making a man's vest out of hummingbird skins. And so I think it was a mindset change that kicked in after this legislation was passed, and it's carried over into other areas in conservation, I believe. It really has ushered in, like the Endangered Species Act, the Animal Welfare Act, the Environmental Protection Act. It's this idea that we accept the federal government's role in being a watchdog and enforcing laws. But before this passed, that was rejected. There was the idea that the states should be free to set their own guidelines.
And from my perspective, without getting political, that's a very scary thought. I'm curious, folks that are involved in the industries now that would pursue hunting, and I have a lot of friends, a couple of them have been on this podcast. They're upland bird hunters. Okay.
Mhm.
And they will very much tell you today that hunters are very much conservationists. They want their hobby, and they love to be outdoors. It's cathartic, and it keeps you away from this little piece of this computer that's in front of us right now.
Mhm.
What has been their reaction to this book? Because I imagine you've had a lot of opportunity now to get out there and to be on other podcasts and interviews on TV or speak to clubs. What's been the
Mhm.
perception or the response, that's the correct word,
Yeah.
to this book?
Well, I think, as you said, that hunters really do make the best conservationists because they're on the front line. They're all about the balance of nature. And I think they want to see the beauty of nature continuing on for their children and grandchildren. So most of the people that I have talked to have been supportive of this. One of the figures in my book that is pretty prominent is Theodore Roosevelt. He was a friend of McLean.
Mm.
I demonstrate that they had many interactions together, including they did go hunting together. And I think most conservationists admire Theodore Roosevelt in the sense that he represents that sort of intelligent hunting of let's keep a balance, but they love the sport. And so I think the reaction has been positive that we have a set of rules that we all abide by, and that it will perpetuate nature for time to come, and our sons and daughters and grandchildren will be able to enjoy this hobby as well.
Very good. Now I am curious, your parents, aunts and uncles, grandparents, if they're still alive, that is fantastic. But if they're not, may they rest in peace. What has been the reaction to the family? Because as you described, he was a little bit of a pariah in the family. What's been the
Well,
reaction there?
quite honestly, Howard, is mixed. There's one other issue that McLean, he voted on 3 constitutional amendments during his time in the Senate, the 17th, 18th, and 19th. He opposed prohibition, which was kind of far-seeing. He thought that was a throwback to the 17th century morality that you couldn't enforce. He was for the 17th Amendment, and that's a jeopardy question. What's that? The direct election of senators. It used to be in the hands of state legislators. It was very corrupt. Mm-hmm. So he wanted that to be put into a popular election of senators in 1913. He voted for that. So on 2 of the 3, he probably, my family would say thumbs up. But on the 19th Amendment, he voted against women's suffrage. And that for most of my family is an unforgivable sin.
Yeah.
And I understand that it's foreign to me how a person could be vote against women's suffrage. But if nothing else, I try to unpack why he felt that way. A good biographer doesn't try to excessively praise their subject, nor do they want to just condemn them. They want to seek to understand why they took the positions that they did, and to understand society at large as far as who they were representing. And it also shows why it took so long to pass women's suffrage, because he felt that that were traditional roles between men and women. We were at war, at World War I, and that only men should vote on national issues because they could only do the fighting. His wife was against women's suffrage. And so I want to show the nuances of the subject, that many women opposed women's suffrage because they wanted to preserve some traditional roles. And the last point on the women's suffrage is that the world was changing so rapidly during his lifetime. Imagine growing up when you didn't have electricity or cars or telephones, and the population was doubling in size. I think they wanted to hold on to some vestige of the past and some sense of connection to the values that they did cherish, because so much was rapidly changing. But I hope that people who hear this now can say, I don't agree with him on that one issue, and I can't understand that. But look what he did for birds. Look what he did in his life overall. And what can I learn about society at large from this opposition? But there are some people in my family that just say, I don't like him. How could he be against women's suffrage? And I don't like, and therefore I really don't, I'm not interested in him. And I kind of struggle with that, but people have hot feelings about politics. And I guess it's, even when you're looking back in time, they still do.
I can appreciate that sentiment. I mean, it exists even today. On one hand, we agree with a point of view, but on the other hand, we might disagree on another point of view from the same person. But I think that's what we need to learn to do, is to learn to disagree, but also appreciate what we're bringing to the table.
Mhm.
How long did Senator MacLean stay in the Senate? How many terms did he have?
He had 3 terms. He was elected first in 1911, and then he retired in 1929. Many people wanted him to run for a 4th term, but he was 72 years old when he left the Senate, and he had no desire to, he wanted to retire, and he went back to his farm that he grew up on. He totally left the urban life and became a dairy farmer and grew shade tobacco in Connecticut. He loved that lifestyle. As I said, I think he was conflicted in the sense that he loved modernization and industrialization, but he chose to remain years on his boyhood farm. He was very wealthy. He had a law practice with clients like New Haven Railroad, Aetna Insurance, a new startup company called AT&T. He helped them set up all their telephone infrastructure around New England. And so he was at one time the largest landholder in Connecticut. He had 4,000 acres of land, and he tended to that in his retirement. But he died only 2 years into his retirement. And in his will, he left all of that land to be set aside in perpetuity in what is now called the McLean Game Refuge. And people in Connecticut, this is a very popular place for hiking, miles of hiking trails. There's 4,000 acres of land. And he wanted this to be made available to the general public so they could enjoy, as he said in his will, the things of God that he found in nature, the peace of mind, body, and spirit that he found there. And so that's another part of his legacy, is this leaving the McLean Game Refuge to the people of Connecticut for their enjoyment in perpetuity.
If others wanted to research Senator MacLean, much like you have, you had in some cases, a semi-front row seat, having been related. Where would they go to learn more about him? Would it be in Washington, a library somewhere?
Well, there really weren't many books about him before I undertook this project. He was a very private individual. He didn't leave a lot of his own writings behind. I was able to collate many of his letters that were in other archives around the country. But I used a lot of newspaper sources to reconstruct his life, because he led a very public life. Mm-hmm. But I was hoping to fill this gap of a lack of knowledge about him. I think many people know about the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but very few people know the story behind it. And that's what my book is attempting to do, is to show this 7-year struggle in the Senate. And then decades before that, of the apathy and opposition that existed in Congress to pass any federal legislation. So I think there really has been a lack of information about him as a person and the personal story behind passage of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act before my book came out.
If you were to take a look back now on your journey and having over the years gathered data, content about the senator, and now you've successfully authored a book. It's been published by a university press. What's your feelings about the journey you have been on? Have you achieved your PhD?
Well, in many ways, it's changed me in being more empathetic toward understanding people are multifaceted and they're made up of strengths and weaknesses and flaws, and that we need to appreciate them as a total person and not engage in this kind of black and white thinking that is so tempting for us as humans. And I see him as a flawed person in many ways, but I also deeply admire his commitment to wanting to serve and to do something about a problem that had been neglected for decades, and that is the protection of migratory birds. So I admire that tremendously, and that he had so many options not to serve. He was very wealthy. He could have lived the good life, the Jay Gatsby good life of the 1920s. He was very wealthy, immensely wealthy, but instead he wanted to come back and serve in the U.S. Senate for this 18-year period to do what he thought was right. Instead of living the good life, I concluded he wanted to lead a better life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that inspires all of us not to just settle for what's easy or what's selfish, but to try to find ways to serve people in the situations that we are in and make a difference.
I think we could use a lot more of that sentiment in this day and age. What has been or have been your aha moments as you have been on this journey to not only understand and unpack who Senator MacLean was, but also the impact of you now being a published author? What's been your aha moment or moments?
Yeah, I think one is that I realized just how difficult it is to lead change, and to see how he persevered through that, the adversity that he faced in his life that I haven't really talked about, but it's in the book. He learned a good deal about how to be a good leader of change. He learned how to form consensus, to overcome obstacles by incorporating some of the legitimate objections of people that opposed him in this Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and building consensus and working with Woodrow Wilson to get this passed. I really admire people who lead change the right way. They're not bullies, they're not dictators, but they are thoughtfully looking at representing legitimate opposition, forming consensus, and focused on solving problems and not just finger pointing and intentionally avoiding solving problems. So I really admire that sentiment. I'm going to be a little optimistic on you, Howard, in saying that I think we will return to that day. It's not going to happen overnight. But one of the things I've learned is that he was coming out of the Civil War. He had memories of the Civil War ending. And I think his generation was committed to putting behind them the polarization of the Civil War and to bring people together, literally bringing the country back together. And they were focused on solving problems. This is called the progressive era. From about 1900 to 1920. There were many social, economic, and political and environmental problems that existed. And it was leaders like McLean and Theodore Roosevelt and many, many others who came together to focus on truly solving problems and getting past the polarization of previous generations. And my hope and prayer is that we will have that happen for us, that we're in a sort of a Civil War mentality right now in our country. But I'm hoping that future generations like my kids who can't relate to some of these aging leaders that we have will get past of all that and start focusing on how do we solve the key problems that we face together as Americans and do something about it and move past finger pointing and culture wars and this polarization that I think most of us really don't like.
I think your words are very profound, and I truly appreciate that. Any final thoughts about your journey as the author and getting to be on podcasts like this or your speaking engagements? That's got to be pretty cool too. I mean, you had a successful career, but now you have a new successful career.
Well, I really enjoyed being on this podcast with you. When I went out to Connecticut to do a book tour out there, one of my presentations, I was introduced by one of the current senators of Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, and he said all the right things. You know how people like that can make you feel like you're the most important person on the face of the earth, and he had said he read my book and he loved my book, and that to me was very meaningful in the kind of poetry of a current U.S. senator from Connecticut paying tribute to one of his predecessors. So that was certainly a thrill, but it's just bringing this person back to life, I think, is most gratifying. That he was neglected within my family. I think he's been neglected nationally, even internationally. For people to see the importance of this act, as demonstrated by that bald eagle resurgence that I mentioned earlier, even if you're not a bird lover, I think you see the value of our coming back from only 400 nesting pairs of bald eagles in 1963 to now over 70,000. And that's been enabled by this legislation. And it wasn't easy to pass it and to see what people before us, it's that cliche of we stand on the shoulders of giants. He's one of those people that came before us that fought the fight to get us in this position where we can protect these beautiful creatures, these God-given creatures that we have. And so I hope that for me, that's the most fulfilling part of this, is to bring him back to life in that sense, to make him a real person. And so that people can see what he did and the importance of what he did, and to deepen our appreciation for our challenge to continue to be vigilant about protecting wildlife and birds in the future.
I love it. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, Will, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and your work, where are the best places for them to go?
Well, I have a website, my name, willgreeley.com, Greeley. The book is easily available on Amazon. And if nothing else, I tell people, ask your local library to get a copy of this book. That's in some ways more gratifying to me than the sales. It's knowing that the book is in a library, made available to many more people than just if you buy your own personal copy. But getting a local library to own this book, read it that way if you don't want to buy your own copy. I'm emphasizing that in many of my talks because I would just like this story to be made more available to many people, especially nature lovers, people who care about birds and wildlife and the environment. Mm-hmm. So that would be, go to Amazon if you want the book, or go to your local library and ask them to acquire it. But I just appreciate the opportunity today, Howard, to share the core of his life with you and your listeners. And I think you'll be further enriched by reading the story if these themes appeal to you.
Fantastic. And definitely, I think there's a lot to be encouraged by stories like this. And it's a great reminder that we can work together and collaborate. We may not always agree, but we can find some way to come to a consensus. Well, it's been a pleasure to have you on the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. And I will probably make a pitch after the episode is over for you to check out the Outdoor Writers Association of America. Every year we have an excellence in craft competition, and one of the competitions are for books. And I think your book would be a great addition to that competition. We'll have a conversation about that afterwards. But again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy day. It's better retirement that you're really busy and like, oh my God, where'd the time go? And it's been an absolute pleasure again. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Howard. I appreciate your professionalism, and I can tell you love the outdoors, and I appreciate your time that you spent with me today.
Fantastic. Listen, stay in the line. We're going to do a real quick close, and you and I can have a final chat. All right, folks, we have just been chatting with Will McLean Greeley, author of A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington, Senator George P. McLean, the Birdman of the Senate. And in today's episode, we chatted with Will about, again, Senator George P. McLean, and specifically the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, or by its acronym, the MBTA, and its importance and its continued relevance here in 2023. And it should not be lost on you that Will and the senator are related, and we learn a lot about the senator's history, especially with his family, but also where his passions were, and especially the need for some type of solution to just the destruction of our species, either through hunting, through the trades, or to the over hunting for food. And again, what this book talks about too is the balance that needs to be in place between our desire to have fun and enjoyment, but also to protect the very species that also coexist with us. Case in point, the bald eagle and some of the birds and the egrets, etc. And I, for one, as someone who enjoys birding, especially as a photographer, and just listening to their sounds in my backyard over a nice cup of coffee in the morning, I really appreciate that this act exists. Now, do go out to Will's website at willgreeley.com. You can learn more about him and his work. There's a lot of quotes there from folks who have read the book, and we're also going to provide a backlink to the book on our show notes. So if you enjoyed this episode, check us out on our website, outdooradventureseries.com. You can find us on our LinkedIn and Facebook pages, Outdoor Adventure Series, and we're on YouTube. We'll have a short get to know you segment with Will published there. And of course, you can find us on all of the major podcast directories. Okay, folks, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we will see you on a future episode of the Outdoor Adventure Series podcast. Take care now.